A century ago, America's wealthiest families spent entire seasons ensconced in palatial hotels, built by private fortunes, sustained by cheap labor, and filled by a national rail network that stretched over 250,000 miles. It wasn't taste or imagination that ended this era. It was progressive taxation, economic upheaval, and the rise of modern business logic that made new grand hotels impossible to justify. But to understand why these public palaces disappeared, we need to examine the economic and social machinery that created them, and the moment it all began to unravel. In the decades after the Civil War, the United States became a nation defined by its extremes. By 1913, the top 1% of Americans controlled nearly 45% of all private wealth, a level of concentration rivaled only by the heights of the early 20th century. This wasn't an accident of fate or a product of gradual accumulation. It was the result of an economic order that funneled the profits of railroads, steel, oil, and finance into the hands of a small circle of industrialists, names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, and Flagler. Their fortunes ran into the tens of billions of dollars, measured in the currency of their time. The scale of their disposable income was unprecedented, and so was their appetite for public display. These magnates didn't just build mansions or acquire art. They turned to projects that could broadcast their status to an entire nation. Grand hotels became the ultimate stage, public palaces where the elite could see and be seen, where a single season stay might cost more than the average American's yearly wage. These hotels were not financed by distant shareholders or government grants. They rose from the pooled capital of private syndicates, often composed of the very families who controlled the railroads that delivered guests to their doors. The original Waldorf Astoria in New York, for example, was funded by a group of investors who raised roughly $3 million in equity, an extraordinary sum in the 1890s, and secured an additional $10 million in secondary financing. Such undertakings would have been unthinkable without an environment of abundant, untaxed capital. Before 1913, the federal government's revenue came almost entirely from tariffs and excise taxes. There was no federal income tax. For the wealthiest Americans, this meant that the profits from their businesses, their investments, and their real estate flowed to them with minimal interruption. State and local taxes on property or hotels were modest, and some regions even offered incentives to lure the construction of luxury resorts. The result was a system where the marginal cost of investing in a grand hotel, whether as a passion project or a calculated business venture, remained low. The money that might have been siphoned away by tax collectors instead circulated among syndicates and partnerships, underwriting the construction of hotels that rivaled European palaces in scale and ambition. This pool of capital was not only large, but also flexible. When a new resort town beckoned or a social season demanded a fresh spectacle, syndicates could mobilize millions in today's dollars almost overnight. The financial logic was reinforced by the social logic. The same families who funded the hotels also filled their suites, attended their balls, and set the tone for society columns across the country. The Grand Hotel era was inseparable from the era of concentrated wealth and weak taxation. It was a world where capital sought not just profit, but prestige. A world that could only exist as long as the economic machinery kept the fortunes of the few intact and largely untouched by the demands of the many. By the late 19th century, the United States had built a rail network stretching over 254,000 miles, knitting together cities, small towns, and remote resorts. This infrastructure did more than move freight or commuters. It created a physical pipeline that delivered the nation's wealthiest families directly to the doors of grand hotels. On lines like the Florida East Coast Railway, owned by Henry Flagler, trains ran from New York and Boston straight to Palm Beach and Miami, making it possible to escape northern winters for months at a time. In New York and New England, the New York Central and Pennsylvania railroads ferried guests to Newport and Saratoga Springs, while the Chicago, St. Paul, and Pacific Line channeled Midwestern elites to Lake Geneva and beyond. Rail corporations did not just transport guests, they shaped the very logic of the grand hotel season. Many railroads owned or controlled the hotels themselves. bundling travel and lodging into a single, seamless package. Advertisements promised a worry-free journey. One ticket covered the Pullman car, the baggage transfer, and a suite at the resort. Families would book entire floors or wings, unpack their trunks in early June, and remain through Labor Day, their routines dictated by the rhythm of the rails. The length of stay was measured in weeks or months, not days. This model depended on predictability. Trains ran on fixed schedules, delivering a steady flow of guests and supplies, while also exporting the seasonal labor force, often immigrants and African American workers who made the luxury experience possible. Rail hotel packages turned travel itself into a ritual. The opening of Grand Central Depot in 1871, and later its transformation into Grand Central Terminal in 1913, symbolized the scale of this migration. Every summer, society columns tracked the departure of New York's elite as they boarded express trains bound for Saratoga, Newport, or the Adirondacks. In Florida, Flagler's rail line stitched together a winter colony, with the Royal Poinciana and the Breakers in Palm Beach operating as extensions of the railroad's reach. Even the architecture of these hotels reflected their dependence on rail, grand entrances facing the tracks and timetables shaping the daily schedule of meals, balls, and outings. Bundled fares were not just a convenience, they were a business strategy. By guaranteeing occupancy for entire seasons, railroads and hotel syndicates could justify the immense capital sunk into palatial buildings and vast staffs. A family summer at the Grand Union, or the Hotel Vanderbilt, was not a vacation in the modern sense, but a temporary relocation, made possible by the reliability and scale of the rail system. This system worked only as long as the trains ran full, and the social calendar revolved around the season. The grand hotels and the railroads formed a self-reinforcing ecosystem, each sustaining the other. When the logic of mobility changed, the entire edifice would become fragile. But for a generation, rail-driven migration made the Grand Hotel era possible. Behind the marble lobbies and chandeliered ballrooms, the grand hotels of the Gilded Age ran on a hidden engine, a workforce of hundreds, drawn from the swelling ranks of immigrant laborers and managed with industrial precision. A single payroll ledger from a property like the Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire, opened in 1902 with 200 rooms, reveals the scale. Over 200 names fill its columns: stewards, porters, chambermaids, cooks, valets, and groundskeepers, each paid a wage that, by modern standards, barely registered above subsistence. In the early 1900s, a chambermaid might earn $20 a month, a steward perhaps $25 a month. These figures were not outliers. Across the country, from Palm Beach to Saratoga Springs, the ratio of staff to guest rooms often approached 1-to-1, sometimes even higher in peak season. This invisible army made possible the rituals of elite society. Formal dinners for 300, midnight balls with full orchestras, and daily services in private salons required a level of staffing and coordination more akin to a small factory than a modern hotel. The payroll was only part of the story. Banquet receipts and private event bookings brought in sums that rivaled room income, especially during the high season when the social calendar dictated a near constant stream of functions. The hotel's steward, responsible for provisioning and staff discipline, became a key figure, part logistics officer, part social gatekeeper. His authority extended from the kitchens to the salons, ensuring that every detail met the expectations of guests who measured status by the smoothness of service. Yet, for all their grandeur, these hotels depended on a delicate balance. The steady flow of elite cash, sustained by untaxed fortunes and reinforced by the social obligation to be seen, was the lifeblood of operations. Any disruption to this ecosystem, whether from rising labor costs, new regulations, or a sudden contraction in elite spending, threatened not just profitability, but the very logic of the enterprise. The model was built on abundance, abundant capital, abundant labor, and abundant time. When any one of these foundations began to crack, the entire edifice grew unstable. The Grand Hotel was more than a building. It was a social machine, powered by the hands and ambitions of those who remained largely invisible, but without whom the spectacle could not continue. The introduction of the federal income tax in 1913 sent a tremor through America's upper echelons. For the first time, fortunes that once flowed untaxed into syndicates and hotel ventures faced a new drain. The top marginal rate was 7% for incomes above $500,000, and it fell directly on the narrow class that financed and patronized grand hotels. The after-tax surplus that once supplied millions of dollars for new builds began to shrink. By the mid-19-teens, bankers and investors found their calculations altered. The business of underwriting a lavish resort, never easy to justify on pure profit, now had to compete with a growing tax drag and a changing investment climate. The effect was not immediate collapse, but a gradual tightening. With less disposable income among the wealthy, syndicates struggled to raise the equity necessary for new construction. Banks, watching the pool of elite liquidity contract, demanded more collateral and higher down payments. The cost of borrowing began a slow climb. In the prosperous years of the 1920s, construction loans for luxury hotels carried interest rates of 4%. By 1930, those rates had more than doubled, reaching 9% as lending institutions recoiled from risk. The Great Depression accelerated the squeeze. The crash of 1929 vaporized paper wealth, froze credit markets, and left even the most prestigious properties scrambling for cash. For hotel operators, the numbers turned bleak. Occupancy rates in the most storied resorts, properties that once boasted full seasons, fell to less than 30%. With fixed costs locked in by vast staffs, maintenance, and debt service, negative operating margins became the rule rather than the exception. Receiverships and fire sales swept through the sector. The original Waldorf Astoria, once a monument to Gilded Age ambition, was sold to a syndicate in 1929 and demolished within the year. Across the country, the Grand Hotel model, already weakened by progressive taxation and rising labor costs, now faced a credit system unwilling to finance risk, and a clientele no longer able or willing to fill its rooms. What had once been a virtuous cycle of elite capital and predictable returns became a downward spiral. As the cost of money soared and the pool of wealthy patrons contracted, the logic that supported grand hotel construction evaporated. By the early 1930s, the prospect of raising millions of dollars for a new palace had become unthinkable. The fiscal and financial shocks of the era did not just slow new projects, they rendered the entire model insolvent. The age of the grand hotel was over, not by choice, but by the irreversible shift in the structures that once made it possible. After World War II, the foundations that once supported grand hotels gave way to a new kind of American mobility and aspiration. Home ownership, once a privilege of the few, expanded rapidly. In 1940, just 44% of American households owned their homes. By 1960, that figure had risen to 62%, propelled by the GI Bill and a surge in suburban development. The dream of a private house with a yard, accessible by car, became the new standard for middle-class families. At the same time, the automobile moved from luxury to necessity. Car registrations soared from 26 million in 1945 to 74 million by 1960. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 authorized the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways, linking cities, suburbs, and vacation destinations in ways that the old rail networks never could. For the first time, families could bypass train stations and travel directly to beaches, mountains, or roadside attractions on their own schedule. Seasonal migration by rail, once the lifeblood of grand hotels, faded as Americans embraced the freedom of the open road. Technological innovation further eroded the exclusivity that grand hotels once offered. AIR conditioning, which spread quickly through hotels and motels in the 1950s, made it possible to vacation anywhere, at any time of year. The need to escape summer heat by retreating to a mountain or seaside resort lost its urgency. Motels and new hotel chains, often built along highways, offered modern comforts at a fraction of the cost, and without the formality or social barriers of the old elite enclaves. These shifts permanently altered demand. The grand hotel, designed for a narrow class and a fixed social season, could not compete with a hospitality market now oriented toward flexibility, affordability, and mass access. The monopoly of the elite on leisure travel ended, replaced by a system that rewarded scale, standardization, and year-round occupancy. The era of public palaces for the few gave way to a landscape shaped by millions of private journeys. In 1952, a Memphis businessman named Kemmons Wilson opened the first Holiday Inn. His idea was simple but radical. He wanted to build a network of hotels that offered consistent standards, affordable rates, and easy access by car. Instead of marble lobbies and ballrooms, these properties featured parking lots, air conditioning, and televisions in every room. The business model was not built around spectacle or social ritual, but around efficiency and predictability. Wilson's franchise system allowed local owners to operate under a single brand, following uniform guidelines set by the parent company. This approach slashed the capital needed to enter the hotel market, where a grand hotel might require $50,000 or more per room to construct. A Holiday Inn averaged just $12,000. The difference was not just in architecture or amenities, but in the logic of investment itself. For investors, the calculus had shifted. The grand hotel model depended on a narrow pool of elite capital, seeking prestige as much as profit, and willing to accept low returns over long seasons. By the 1950s, rising land values in cities and resort towns made such projects prohibitively expensive. Chain hotels, by contrast, could be built quickly on less expensive parcels, scaled to meet demand, and operated with a fraction of the staff. The franchise model offered steady cash flows, year-round occupancy, and the security of a recognized brand, features that attracted banks and institutional investors seeking reliable returns. Land value escalation reinforced the trend. As urban and resort land prices soared in the post-war boom, the opportunity cost of devoting prime real estate to a seasonal luxury palace became unsustainable. Developers and financiers favored standardized hotels that maximized revenue per square foot. The economics left little room for the old model. Holiday Inn's rapid expansion, over 1,000 properties by the late 1960s, demonstrated the new logic at work. The age of grand hotels ended not because Americans lost their taste for grandeur, but because the financial and structural incentives that once supported public palaces for the elite no longer existed. Today, luxury hotels serve global markets and corporate travelers, not a single class of seasonal elites. Economic incentives now favor efficiency over spectacle. Profit, not prestige, drives design. The systems that built America's grand hotels, from extreme wealth concentration to cheap labor and rigid social hierarchies, have fundamentally shifted. In the end, architecture follows capital. The age of public palaces ended when the logic that sustained them disappeared. Share your thoughts below.